Guys, it's been a while since I've shared a video with you, and I just wanted to share an old presentation that I came across that I did actually in Vegas in 2014 at one of the shows. And I think this is a super important issue in the field of prosthetics and orthotics. And the title of it is A Comparison of Distal Pressures on Non-Airtight and Airtight Shuttle Locks. So let's hop in. In 1983, Carl Fillauer created the first shuttle lock. And this was really a groundbreaking shuttle lock because we had always been doing cuff straps and the like, or P-Lite self-suspending supracondylar systems. So 1983, he creates this locking mechanism, and I remember fabricating this many times as not only a technician but a resident, and it's probably still one of the best-selling locks in the whole prosthetic industry, even to this day. Let's see, that's going on 40 years, 35 years. So anyway, I remember a whooshing sound that always would come from this lock. And how do we cure that? We ended up putting a little piece of felt on either the post of the button, or what a lot of the technicians would do, and this is what I did, is I cut a round piece of cream cow and then I would glue it over the button itself, and the whooshing sound was gone. But that whooshing sound really was a symptom of what is going on inside the socket. Definitely movement for sure. Now in 1999, Coyote Design and Willowwood both released an airtight locking mechanism, and I think they were really onto something and really ahead of their time at that time. Now what we're going to be talking about specifically the Coyote Design locking mechanism, but really this goes with all airtight locking mechanisms, but I believe there's still only two of them with Willowwood and Coyote Design. So take a look at this video. We're going to come back to it, but this is a patient engaging into the socket and then walking around.
Just kind of nothing up and down.
So he says nothing up and down. He tries to jiggle it off. He can't get it off. And then he goes on and sits down. So just remember this video and we'll come right back to it. Now, a lot of people smarter than me created the system to check the distal end pressures. Essentially what happened is there's sensors at the distal end of the socket, and the higher the voltage, the more pressure there was. There's mechanisms and hoses going everywhere, but it was really easy to filter out that data and evaluate the data just because we were looking at voltages and voltage spikes. So we talk about curve shapes, and what we're doing is we're looking at how the curve actually goes. So you have this terminal stance pre-swing when you're really loading the toe, and then you've got initial contact and loading response when you're loading the heel. So this is the non-airtight locking mechanism. And what you see is these kind of gradual stair steps of pressure going to a peak. And this is important because we're going to look at the next slide. So same thing happens, gradual pressure going to peak pressure, both at terminal stance and pre-swing, and at initial contact loading response. So there is the non-airtight locking mechanism. And now we're looking at the airtight locking mechanism. So terminal stance pre-swing, and look at this, you have a nice curve on both. You do not have a spike in pressure, and in fact the pressure seems to be very much the same over the whole area. So pretty neat. The data doesn't lie. We're just seeing even pressures over the distal end when you have an airtight locking mechanism. Now let's talk about two measurements. The first is amplitude. So amplitude is the range that is covered. So for instance, I don't know how high snowboarders go, but let's say 25 feet. So they cover a range of 25 feet or an amplitude of 25 feet. Then we talk about magnitude. What is the highest that they reach? And that may be 25 feet as well. So you've got a range and then the actual height. So let's look at the pressure difference between a non-airtight and an airtight locking mechanism. One of the things I just want to draw your attention to is look at these spikes. So, and then the other thing that you look at is each area is at different levels. So what that means is the patient, when they're walking, they're actually feeling different amounts of pressure varying at each step. It is not a consistent step. And the other thing that I want you to look at is look at the range of pressures that this patient's distal end experiences. That's pretty incredible. So when you're looking at the airtight locking mechanism, look, you've got pressures that are fairly even all the way across, significantly lower in magnitude all the way across, and even at this initial contact and loading response, the pressure stays low across the whole timeline, which is a very, very interesting characteristics, and we think it just has a lot to do with some of the suction effects of a non-airtight locking mechanism. You see, air is not able to sneak in through the bottom of the socket, and we know that air doesn't get drawn in through the top. So very interesting there. So that's this graph. Pretty telling between a non-airtight and an airtight locking mechanism. All right, so we're just going to break it down. If the charts don't do it for you, the numbers should. In a non-airtight locking mechanism, the amplitude or the range of pressures are 1.1, and I believe that's millivolts, with a magnitude, the highest pressure being 2.7 millivolts. Whereas the airtight locking mechanism is 0.6 millivolts as far as the range, with a magnitude of 2.1 millivolts. Why is this significant? Well, it's significant because the patient is experiencing 2 times the amount of pressure, over a larger range, and then the magnitude is also higher. So not only is the patient experiencing higher distal end pressures, but they're also getting these spikes up to the 2.7 millivolts, which is 0.6 millivolts higher than the airtight locking mechanism. All that to say is the numbers show that if the system is an airtight system, the patient will experience less distal pressures. And that makes a lot of sense, because a lot of people do vacuum and suction, and patients will say, hey, I'm not getting the distal end pressure that I was getting, say, in a locking mechanism. That brings me to really a lot of people have a bad experience with locking mechanisms because they're not airtight. And so there are multiple patients that I've fit that have said, no, locking systems don't work for me. I can't do them. I get all kinds of pistoning. My limb gets milked. It feels like it gets milked. And I do listen to them, but then I just ask them if they'd be willing to try an airtight locking mechanism. And more often than not, patients are so surprised by that difference of an airtight locking mechanism. So remember that previous video, the guy got into his socket and walked around, tried to jiggle it off. He said it doesn't feel like it's coming off. And so the part that I didn't show you is this is what happened right before he got into his socket. We actually took the pin out. and he walked around.
There's nothing up and down. None of that. That was a great fit.
So what's interesting is that we show that if you take the airtight nature of the socket away, look what happens. The socket just falls right off. So what that tells me, and what this video tells me, is that for certain types of limbs, the pin actually becomes a secondary locking mechanism or protective mechanism because of the airtight nature of the socket. This guy, because of the shape of his limb, was able to keep it through some friction, but definitely suction on his leg. So airtight makes a big, big difference. And that brings me to my last point. Airtight locking mechanism. I love the Coyote design. Airtight locking mechanism. I can never think of a time other than, say, some sort of open frame AK socket that I would do a non-airtight locking mechanism, and then I would never do a clutch locking mechanism. The main reason I would never do a clutch locking mechanism is you don't know if you're actually pulling the patient's leg in or just the liner, and the downsides of pulling just the liner in far outweigh the positives of using a clutch lock. So thanks again for watching, guys.